No? All right, guys, if we can all come and get a seat, we'll get underway. Right. Sorry for the delay. We've all probably been through 50 Zoom meetings this year, yet somehow we still run into problems. So I don't know if anyone's popped it yet, but we haven't. But welcome to New Zealand Christians in Science and to the Maclaurin Chapel, and we are very pleased to be here with our new chaplain, Reverend Dr. Tim Pratt. So we're really happy that you're here and really appreciate the ongoing support of the chaplaincy. We are very happy to be meeting back in person, so thank you for venturing out. And also thank you to all our Zoom people. We've got our Zoom cohort meeting with us tonight as well. So just some housekeeping. If you've not signed in with the QR code, make sure you do that. And leave your email address as well. That's probably the main way we'll get into contact with you and let you know what's going on. And make sure you look at our website. That is where all of our resources are. So you'll find all our webinars and our lectures and our blog posts there. And also for all the people at Zoom, you can participate tonight. If you have a question that pops up, just write it in the chat box, in the chat function, and then we'll try and get to the most of those. So tonight is our very last lecture in our winter series on finding meaning post-pandemic. I think originally this lecture was meant for August, so we're really happy to be here in person. I'm really happy to be here, not at home, with my 3 children that I have spent a lot of time with this year. I love them, but I'm very happy to be here. And we're very happy to have our guest, Sarah Beattie, with us tonight, who has come all the way from Wellington and is speaking on finding meaning in scripture and science, but you will hear more about that. So a little bio on our speaker tonight. So Sarah Beattie has a Bachelor of Education, a graduate diploma in theology, a master's in aspects and implications of biblical interpretation, and is currently finishing her PhD in hermeneutics. Over the last 20 years, she has facilitated and groups, Bible and theological studies. The increasing challenges to biblical testimony and Christian tradition arising from perceptions of the impact of science on Christian belief led her to postgraduate research, and her PhD thesis focuses on the interpretation of biblical narratives in the 21st century world. Although her background is in the arts, which is very welcome here, she believes that all Christians are now, to some extent, Christians in science due to the rapid developments in and growing dependence on science and technology. This should not, however, be a threat to traditional belief, but rather offers an exciting opportunity to explore how science can contribute to a deeper understanding of biblical reality. So, welcome.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for Zooming. It's a great privilege to share some of my research with you, although I wasn't sure when Nicola said finding meaning in science and scripture, whether that was an achievable thing in one evening. I don't think I've found all the answers, but I'm going to take you on something of a whirlwind tour of reality tonight, from the microscopic of the quantum world to the macroscopic of the cosmos. The reality of being human in the midst of this, and what the biblical perspective of reality contributes to our understanding of how we fit into the world. It's about the possible conceptual connections between science and scripture and where they might converge. But I want to stress that this is in the sense of kinship, and John Polkinghorne talks about this. It's not a direct transfer of concepts. I think they belong in certain places, but I think, as he says, there is a sense of kinship, and I want to look at this tonight. So it's really just a journey of exploration tonight, of ideas and possibilities, which I hope will promote some interesting things to think about. I'm going to have to stick to the script, because if not, I'll get distracted and I'll wander off and we won't get through everything. But I am going to try and include rather a lot tonight. I'm not sure if I should apologize now or later for that. But, anyway, here goes. A bit of a whirlwind tour. I was going to call it Wonders in the Heavens, and then I thought well, actually, it's also about creation and destruction in the cosmos. And I couldn't decide between the two, so I've put them both there. And I've put them on a background, which I will use later on as just background. This is Hubble Ultra Deep Field, and there are about 10,000 galaxies in that picture, and it's going back about 13.2 billion light years. So that is one of the wonders that we are finding out about thanks to modern science. So, anyway, as Emma said, I'm not a scientist. My background is in the arts, but I think that all Christians today are, to some extent, Christians in science, as science and technology do play such a big part in our lives. And it's the impact of this that's led me to about 16 years now of theological research, in particular in the area of biblical interpretation or hermeneutics. And I like the definition of hermeneutics. Sorry, just wave at me if I get quiet, because I've got a naturally quite quiet voice. I like the definition of hermeneutics as the art and science of interpretation. And what I'm hoping to do tonight is firstly to highlight some of the current, or one of the current challenges that science appears to present to the discovery of meaning in biblical narrative and subsequent expressions of Christian belief. Secondly, I want to explain the background to and motivation for my thesis, which I'm hoping to complete this year. Thirdly, to outline the focus of the thesis, and finally to offer some ideas about and an example of how contemporary science might provide rather than prevent a way of addressing the current challenge. So I want to start with an announcement that was made on the 4th of July 2012 by the European Centre for Nuclear Research. The Atlas and Cms Experiments at the Large Hadron Collider, the particle accelerator that was heralded as the largest and most sophisticated machine made by humankind, had finally uncovered evidence for a particle consistent with the Higgs boson, the visible manifestation of the Higgs field. And I wanted to put here, that's the Atlas detector. And I just think that having the person standing there gives an idea of just the size of this machine. It weighs about 7,000 tons, which is similar to the weight of the Eiffel Tower. I've got a picture too of, that's the CMS detector. I think again, it just shows the scale on which we're operating now in science. Now, a Newsweek article by a theoretical physicist followed this announcement, and this is what he said. Assuming the particle in question is indeed the Higgs, it validates an unprecedented revolution in our understanding of fundamental physics and brings science closer to dispensing with the need for any supernatural shenanigans all the way back to the beginning of the universe, and perhaps even before the beginning, if there was a before. Humans, with their remarkable tools and their remarkable brains, may have just taken a giant step towards replacing metaphysical speculation with empirically verifiable knowledge. The Higgs particle is now arguably more relevant than God. Now, I'm not going to tell you who that was, some of you might know. The perception that science can or will soon be able to dispense with the supernatural shenanigans was one of the reasons that I undertook postgraduate research, as the challenge to the credibility of the transcendent elements of Christian belief appears to be prevalent inside as well as outside church communities. In facilitating Bible and theological study groups and also in conversation, I've become increasingly aware of a growing confusion about what the Bible means and how to read it. A confusion exacerbated by a significant shift in the conditions of belief. And as our information age is witnessing not only the fastest growth of knowledge in the history of humanity, but also the easiest access to this knowledge. And I wanted to put in this picture here, which is from the Octi project. And that's using tracer root technology to produce a visual representation of the metaphysical space of the internet. And it's mapping the paths which information travels across the world. The different colors show the locations of the different web addresses. And so that is the world. The green is Europe and the Middle East, and I think red is Asia, the blue is parts of America. That just gives you an idea of the way information is traveling. So there's now access to previously unthinkable reality that's been revealed by the development of complex technology in remarkable tools. And this is reality that includes things like subatomic ghost particles. And this is a picture of the neutrino telescopes beneath the ice attempting to capture the bluish light of the elusive subatomic ghost particles or neutrinos that pass through the Earth's core into the pristine waters of Lake Baikal in Siberia. And what we've also got are gravitational waves or ripples in the fabric of space-time that are detected by laser interferometers. And on February the 11th, 2016, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, LIGO, this is the Louisiana interferometer, announced the first detection of gravitational waves. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. And then what's also come to our attention, and this is just popular science for the layperson like me, are of course the black holes, or the places in space where gravity is so strong that light cannot get out. And this was the first and closest possible image of a black hole captured in April 2019 by the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration, which then had 8 ground-based telescopes, radio telescopes, operating around the planet. And it was called Telescope the Size of the Earth. It revealed this image, silhouette of a supermassive black hole, 55 million light years from Earth. So we have these forms of reality, and then of course we have the virtual reality that we have through the internet. And it's a reality that philosopher David Chalmers, who's one of the leading people in the field of consciousness studies, he argues it is a sort of genuine reality, as virtual objects are real objects. And what goes on in virtual reality is truly real. So, the background to the thesis. The impact of these developments, the impact of these different realities that we're living with, is often articulated in varying formulations of, now we know X, with X being perceived developments in scientific knowledge, we can no longer believe Y, with Y often being the transcendent elements of biblical narrative, elements that appear to some to have become redundant baggage of a pre-scientific age. The perspective of reality depicted by biblical narrative, within which natural and supernatural accounts and explanations are constantly intermingled, and the subsequently carefully formulated creeds and doctrines that emerged within the early Christian church, no longer seem to make sense in the light of contemporary knowledge. And if something doesn't make sense, it can be very difficult for it to have any significant meaning. So one seemingly reasonable solution to the issue of supernatural shenanigans has been to dismiss or at least sideline them as now inadequate ways of understanding Christian belief. But I think this raises a significant question of whether, and I quote here, once we start to expunge from the narratives any elements that are offensive to modern understanding, there is a risk that we will be left with a bland mixture of moral ideals that might just as well be expressed in the language of conventional secular humanism. So I wanted to investigate the possibility of finding a way of approaching biblical narrative that could address this issue. A way that could respond to the challenge of discovering meaning while respecting both the integrity of the text and the intellectual integrity of the reader or hearer. This became an investigative journey on which I was often not sure where I'd end up and how it would impact on my traditional Anglican background. So there have been many challenges along the way in attempting to untangle the relationships between knowledge, understanding, explanation, belief, and faith, and to discover how they relate to truth. They're all quite slippery philosophical concepts. But there have also been some surprises, and one of which was the apparent conceptual similarities between the challenge to articulate quantum reality and the challenge that the biblical writers had also faced in attempting to articulate a new and at times counterintuitive perspective of biblical reality within the limitations of language. Limitations that are highlighted by philosopher Thomas Nagle. And he says, and I quote him here, "While it is risky to use existing language to reach beyond its existing limits, we are compelled to do so again and again, however inadequately, in our recognition that our understanding of reality is so limited." Now, I was interested to find a science writer who suggests that, and I quote him, "We can hardly talk about quantum theory as we have mathematics, but not stories." And he cites a physicist who believes that, and I quote, "We will one day tell a story about quantum mechanics. Literally a story, all in plain words, that is so compelling and so masterful in its imagery that the mathematics of quantum mechanics in all its exact technical detail will fall out as a matter of course. That story," he said, "should not only be crisp and compelling, it should also stir the soul." So the imagination and the concept of story appear to continue to be significant forces for contemporary scientific endeavour. According to cognitive scientist Mark Turner, story or narrative imagining is a fundamental instrument of the mind and a literary capacity that is indispensable to human cognition as both a fundamental form of predicting and a fundamental cognitive instrument for planning and explanation. Story and projection are therefore the root of and essential to human thought and two of our basic forms of knowledge. And I was interested that 2 weeks ago, Brian talked about the importance of story in his work as a doctor. Now, if this is correct, a key question, I think, concerns how a deeper understanding of the purpose of story might facilitate a renewed appreciation for the biblical writers, how their plain words and compelling and masterful imagery, resulting from a broad and liberated imagination, might be able to once again stir the soul in the search for a better understanding of the human condition and, in Nagle's words, how we fit into the world in which we live. Now, in a lecture this year, philosopher David Chalmers said, "One of the hardest philosophical problems arising from contemporary science is the problem of quantum reality. What is going on in the physical reality underlying the predictions of quantum mechanics?" But he added that another hard problem is still that of understanding and explaining consciousness. And another surprise that my research presented was how the work of a philosopher who is explicit about his atheism, he doesn't just say he doesn't believe in God, he says he doesn't want there to be a God, he doesn't want the world to be like that. But his work on the problem of consciousness actually became the foundation for my thesis. And this was because I believe that his work inadvertently offers not only important critical insights for biblical interpretation, but also the framework for the development of a specific hermeneutic for the interpretation of biblical narrative. And this brings me to the thesis focus. Now, this philosopher is Thomas Nagle. And in 2013, he published his most controversial book called Mind and Cosmos. And it had the very provocative subtitle, "Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False." He was critiquing what he believed to be the assumptions of an epistemological climate currently dominated by reductive scientific naturalism. And this is in relation to what he calls the ongoing search for a systematic understanding of how we and other living things fit into the world. Although he was explicit about his rejection of theism as a viable option for a comprehensive worldview, the response to the book was swift, disparaging, and in some cases vitriolic. This appeared on the front of one magazine. He was depicted as being a secular heretic burned at the stake, surrounded by the red-robed hooded figures representing currently prominent scientists and philosophers. You can probably guess who a couple of those were. Richard Dawkins was one of them. Daniel Dennett was another. The book was referred to as the shoddy reasoning of a once great thinker, an instrument of mischief containing arguments that were aimed at a market of evolution deniers, intelligent design acolytes, religious fanatics, and others who are not interested, really interested in the substantive, scientific, and philosophical issues. But I hope I don't fall into any of these categories. And I don't want to use his thinking for the apologetic intent that was feared by his detractors. I just want to extrapolate from his work some important insights that I believe to be relevant in the search for meaning in both science and scripture. And the first one is what he calls the true extent of reality. It seemed fitting to put the background of the ultra-deep field behind this. The true extent of reality in what Nagle says in an astonishing world that is independent of and extends beyond the reach of our minds. They are therefore facts that are beyond the limits of our understanding, the current limits, but also potentially beyond the scope of our conceptual ability, raising the issue of the relation between facts and conceptual schemes or systems of representation. The second insight, and this is what Nagle is particularly big about, are the limits of materialist reductionism in explaining the true extent of reality. And this is particularly in relation to higher levels of consciousness. And the potential limits of our understanding, both cognitively and particularly in terms of what is currently regarded as thinkable due to the constraints of the dominant ideology. These are limitations that Nagle believes imply that something more is needed, something more that must be added to the physical conception of the natural order to explain how it can give rise to organisms that are more than physical. The third insight he talks about is the need to recognize what can and cannot in principle be understood by certain existing methods, and the need to deepen our understanding of the problems that inevitably arise in the attempt to find our place in the world. Now, I spent about a chapter on each of these, so I'm racing through them. But the fourth one is asking the right questions, but not formulated just to suit the tools at hand, and then developing the right tools in search for solutions. And the final one I want to look at, or just mention, is the need for alternative forms of understanding to explain the increasingly paradoxical perspectives of reality that, as Nagle points out, challenge our intuitive conception of the world. So I think these all have significant relevance for biblical interpretation. But I also think Nagle offers a possible framework for the development of a specific hermeneutical approach to biblical narrative. The acknowledgement of reality that cannot be constrained to privileged forms of understanding has led Nagle to the conclusion that, and I quote him, an understanding of the universe as basically prone to generate life and mind will probably require a much more radical departure from familiar forms of naturalistic explanation than I am at present able to conceive. And here I think is the hermeneutic. This is radical departure from the familiar that by exploring imaginative alternatives is able to extend the boundaries of the thinkable. And I think this is a theme that I want to suggest is an inherent component of biblical narrative in two ways. Firstly, we see radical departure in a physical or concrete sense. It begins with the Genesis narrative about a radical departure from Eden, the familiar of a home into another world. And it continues with the radical departures for, say, Abraham, Moses, and the people of Israel. But also in the more abstract sense of radical departure from familiar forms of thinking about the world, humankind and the relationships between them, with the imagination playing a vital role in enabling this departure. And I want to be very clear about how I'm using imagination here, because this is imagination that is productive in being able to provide both an insight into the nature of things and the means of presenting ideas which constantly strain after something lying outside the limits of experience. And in this respect, in the words of C.S. Lewis, while reason may be the natural organ of truth, imagination is the organ of meaning and the condition rather than the cause of truth. So I want to suggest that this therefore may be a potentially natural framework for an interpretive approach that allows for what Nagle calls an expansionist rather than a reductionist or an eliminative revision of concepts, a revision that preserves the essential features of the original, but is also open to new discoveries and the exploration of further connections. This is an exploration that's also advocated by philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who refers to new worlds that open up in front of a narrative text when an interpretive approach adopts a broader concept of truth than one within which true history with a direct referential claim and fictional story with an indirect referential claim are opposed. For Ricoeur, it is both the telling of stories and the writing of history that provides shape to what would otherwise remain chaotic, obscure, and mute. It's therefore in the interweaving of history and fiction that new worlds are opened up. And I've incorporated some of Ricoeur's ideas into the hermeneutic. The one I want to mention tonight is his suggestion that as interpreters, we can move from an initial stage of what he calls primitive naivety, or first pre-critical understanding of a text, through a stage of critical inquiry to a second stage of what he calls critically informed, mature naivety. It's not possible, he believes, to go back to the first stage, the pre-critical stage, but there is an option of remaining in what he calls the desert of criticism. But there's also the option of moving to the second stage. And that's what I want to advocate and what I'm going to talk about tonight, that we can move to this second stage, but I want to reformulate it. I want to resist the impression that the acquisition of empirical knowledge automatically leads to superior intellectual maturity. I therefore want to rephrase it as a move from a stage of original receptivity to one of informed receptivity. A stage in which the reader is informed, but not constrained by critical inquiry, and able to heed Nagle's warning about asking the wrong questions, or not asking the wrong questions, or using the wrong tools to interpret the text. So that brings me to interpreting biblical narrative from a position of informed receptivity, from a perspective of radical departure from the familiar, exploring imaginative alternatives, and extending the boundaries of the thinkable. This is the fourth part where I want to try and put it into practice and see how it works. And this is the very exploratory point, and I'd be very interested on your feedback. It's going to be a bit of a roller coaster ride now, because I wanted to look at how this hermeneutic might work in relation to the issue of restoring meaning to supernatural shenanigans. So in my thesis, I actually apply it to three narratives that all contain the theme of new life, but also involve a supernatural being and are therefore potentially problematic to a 21st century mindset. The first one I try it with is the radical departure from Eden at the end of Genesis 3, with the way back barred by the presence of cherubim. The second is Luke's Annunciation narrative, in which an announcement is made by an angel of a new birth, and it's a radical conceptual departure from the familiar. And the third that I want to focus on tonight concerns the vision in Revelation 12, in which a woman clothed in the sun is confronted by a dragon, seeking to devour her newborn child. I want to follow Heisenberg's thoughts here about interpreting quantum reality, and suggest that the interpretation of this passage will necessitate, as Heisenberg suggested with quantum reality, learning how to both ask the right questions, but also how to get into the spirit of biblical reality. Can we still do that? I want to suggest as well, though, that a focus on the concept of ancient light in both science and scripture might lead to some interaction that can assist this learning. Interaction that I hope respects the integrity of both science and scripture in the search for meaning, but seeks to approach biblical narrative on its own terms as a unique vision of the reality of Christian hope. So here's our passage, the first 4 verses of Revelation 12, which tells us that a great portent appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pains in the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. Well, birth in the heavens. Now, we don't have a picture, we don't see the Revelation vision. I have to admit that straight away. But I have a background in the arts and I couldn't resist the picture in the middle. I just think it fitted to what I want to say. And I want to start by the image on the left here, which comes from the 1995 Hubble telescope infrared image of the pillars of creation in the Eagle Nebula, about 6,500 light years away from Earth. And it reveals 3 towers of dust that are described as giving birth to new stars buried within their dusty spires. On the other side is the 2011 image of the Monkey Head Nebula, and it reveals another stellar nursery or star-forming region about 6,400 light years away from Earth, in which bright newborn stars near the center of the nebula illuminate the surrounding gas with energetic radiation. Now, the light detected from these newborn stars is actually ancient light that's been traveling for nearly 6,500 years before reaching the eyes of the Hubble telescope. The images that have been produced therefore reflect an ancient birth story that occurred about 6,500 years ago. Now, the narrative images that we have in Revelation 12 also reflect an ancient birth story. The sense of radiant illumination that emerges from the vision reveals a radically different celestial phenomenon from those emerging within contemporary astronomy. It is a vision that has been described as emerging almost like a constellation coming to light in the evening sky. But the light that appears in the darkness in the vision radiates from a luminous woman, who we hear is clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, it's an image that has been described as a woman bedecked with the splendor of God's celestial creation, but it also has a strong resemblance to a mythological queen of heaven in the form of a high goddess or a cosmic queen conceived in astral categories. The significant differences between the biblical woman and her mythic counterparts indicate, however, that the Revelation narrative, while combining material from a variety of sources, which include Jewish tradition and the Old Testament, will be a radical departure from the familiar for its early hearers and readers. And the importance of an awareness of this sense of departure is highlighted in a warning about the danger of the reductive approach, and I quote here, of getting so involved in trying to uncover the sources of John's images and the historical and political reference that one fails to see the overarching vision that John is presenting. One may dissect the text to such an extent that one ends up with a cadaver rather than a living text that continues to inspire, challenge, and embrace the reader. So while there have been many interpretations about the identity of the woman, and they've included the symbolization of people of God, the church, Mary giving birth to the Messiah, Israel, or the Jewish people from whom the Messiah comes, it is possible, and I quote here, that the woman is not Mary, nor Israel, nor the church, but less and more than all of these. John's imagery pulls together elements from the pagan myth of the Queen of Heaven, from the Genesis story of Eve, from Israel who escapes from the dragon Pharaoh into the wilderness, and Zion, mother of the people of God, from whom the Messiah comes forth. She reflects the historical experience of the people of God through the ages, Israel and the church, and yet she is the cosmic woman who brings forth the Messiah. So the radiant image of the woman serves therefore to illuminate the importance of the child that she will bear, who will provide a different form of illumination as a light that will overcome the darkness of chaos or evil. In this respect, the contrast with and radical departure from the depiction of the woman in Genesis 3, who was the first biblical mother of humankind and was clothed only with fig leaves and a garment of skin, is an important feature of the vision. A feature that highlights the significance of the birth that's about to occur, which is also indicated by the echoes of Psalm 104, verse 2, in which God is described as being wrapped in light as with a garment. But the ties to the Genesis narrative are not, however, broken, with a link remaining as the woman cries out in the promised agony of giving birth. But she must now face a dark, destructive force which appears in the form of a great red dragon. Now we're going to do a great leap here to Sagittarius A star, which is a different kind of destructive dark force. This is the inset that shows a close-up view of Sagittarius A star. And this is currently, this force is extending the boundaries of the thinkable in science. And this is the black hole at the center of the Milky Way galaxy. has a mass about 4 million times greater than the Sun. It's described, and I quote here from various sources, as being amongst the one of the most mysterious objects in the universe, a ravenous cosmic beast of 21st century science that drags passers-by to certain doom. It's actually an extremely dense entity from which no light can escape, and with such strong gravitational pull that anything coming within its event horizon will be consumed and never re-emerge. It's an entity that astronomers have observed, this is their language, awakening about once a day and emitting a brief burst of light before settling back into slumber. In 2017, a record-breaking black hole feeding frenzy was announced as another giant black hole located in a small galaxy about 2 billion light years from Earth was reported as having ripped apart a nearby star and then continued to feed off its remains for close to a decade. The report was based on data from 3 orbiting X-ray telescopes, which had revealed evidence of a massive tidal disruption event in which the intense gravity from the black hole causes tidal forces that are able to destroy an object, such as a star, that comes close to it. If we go back to the Event Horizon telescope collaboration, this image is of a black hole about 1,000 times as massive as Sagittarius A star. And it was described as the behemoth at the heart of galaxy M87, resembling an eye of fire, the black hole outlined by the glowing hot gas surrounding its event horizon. Now, the image was only possible because of the development of very long baseline interferometry to detect radio waves or light in a region of the electromagnetic spectrum which is invisible to the naked human eye. Human sight is normally limited to the stars in our Milky Way galaxy, which within a range of about 1,500 light years are observable on a clear night. On March the 19th, 2008, for a period of roughly 40 seconds, it was, however, possible for the naked human eye to witness the most distant astronomical object ever directly seen, with a supernova, or gigantic stellar explosion, that happened so far away that its light took 7.5 billion years to reach Earth. Detected by NASA's Swift satellite, the luminous explosion in the form of a gamma ray burst occurred 3 billion years before our solar system formed. It's consequently been called an echo from the beginning of time. But in a news conference following the sighting, an astrophysicist was reported as referring to the event as the scream or birth pangs of a black hole. It was a birth that heralded the dramatic formation of an entity that would require a radical departure from familiar forms of explanation, with the laws of physics appearing to break down as space and time were broken apart in a region where space is so curved as to collapse in on itself and where time comes to a standstill. Just go back to the background picture now, because I want to go back to the cosmic region in Revelation 12, where the cry of birth pangs also resounds, but in a very, very different way. I've gone back to this because it's also one where no physical laws can be applied, as the narrative makes its own radical departure from the familiar to a point in time and space that's not identifiable within contemporary cosmology. The cosmic drama that unfolds in the narrative presents the modern reader, and I quote here, with something like a movie that thrills audiences with special effects as heroes and villains traverse the galaxies in battles for control of the universe. Now, these are visions which, from the perspective of the hero or reader, are, however, also invisible not just to the naked human eye, but any form of advanced technology. And they can't, therefore, either respond to the questions directed to modern cosmology or be understood by the existing methods used to explain it. The imagery is instead addressed to the imagination of the hero or reader. As a ravenous and formidable cosmic beast in the form of a great red dragon appears seeking to devour the child as soon as it was born. Now, the imagery of this narrative, again perhaps familiar in many respects to its first audiences with the echo of ancient mythologies, is, however, a dramatic reformulation of an imaginative alternative to the combat myths that were widespread in the ancient Near East and classical world. Despite its resonance with pagan mythology, it can be argued that much of the imagery of the draconic creature and storyline in the narrative can be explained on the basis of allusions to the Old Testament and Christian tradition. There's a developmental trajectory from the serpent of the Eden narrative, who, whilst originally a creature that is part of God's creation, and then a seemingly rational and convincing ally, until it's exposed as the initiator of humanity's estrangement from God, has now evolved in this narrative into overtly aggressive and destructive adversary. The enmity between the woman and the serpent in Genesis 3:15 reappears with dramatic intensity as the life of her child is threatened. The serpent dragon is now portrayed as the primeval and ultimate power of supernatural evil. In this respect, the dragon is Python from the Leto myth, also Tiamat, the seven-headed monster of the deep in Babylonian mythology. He's the Leviathan, the serpent-like monster in Hebrew folklore. He's the deceitful serpent in the Garden of Eden. He's also Satan, as we learn later in the Revelation text, the deceiver of the whole world. He's each of these and all of these combined, for he is the representation of all that is evil and chaotic and in opposition to God. Now, the concept of mysterious and potentially dangerous beasts existing beyond the boundaries of the known world prevailed from the oldest known Babylonian world map into the Middle Ages, when the distant edges of the earth were still illustrated as a realm of strange animals and monstrous beings. But in 2011, the astronomer royal Sir Martin Rees suggested that... Sorry, Sarah. Louder, sorry. I'm quoting Martin Rees here. He said, "The bedrock nature of space and time and the structure of the universe exemplify intellectual domains where we are still groping for the truth, where we must still inscribe, 'Here be dragons.'" Now, the language that is used to refer to black holes as ravenous fiery cosmic beasts is not, of course, intended to imply that they represent evil in the form of being morally bad, wicked, or intentionally tending to harm. Despite their use in popular culture as metaphors for death and destruction, they appear to function as gravitational engines at the center of some galaxies, which use matter to create light in converting gravitational potential energy into radiant energy. Matter accelerating towards the event horizon of the black hole emits high-energy electromagnetic radiation that is able, and I quote here, to outshine the whole galaxy, leading to what has been suggested to be an irony of astrophysics, that something so dark can lead to so much light. The concept of light emerging from and overcoming darkness is, however, a key biblical theme. But in contrast to the involuntary violence of the dark cosmic beast of astrophysics, the biblical dragon serves to represent the dark destructive power of an invisible but intentional source of evil that is a threat to the world in which God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. Its initial presentation as an innocuous force in the form of the subtle and persuasive reasoning of a seemingly benevolent serpent gives little indication of the powerful creature that it will become. But the severity of the consequences of capitulation to the lure of self-advancement provides a warning about human fallibility. The newly acquired knowledge and ability to be like God did not lead the first biblical couple to the promised freedom and power, but resulted in the fracturing of relationships between humankind, the world, and other species within it, as well as a separation, of course, from God. Fractures that do not appear to have healed in the troubled and fragile 21st century world. As Nagle points out, and this is from a secular perspective, we still do not really know how to live together and have been given ample reason to fear human nature. Martin Rees describes the 21st century as the first era in 45 million centuries in which the human species can determine for good or ill the future of its entire biosphere, as the threats to our world come from ourselves rather than nature. He echoes Nagle in describing the human brain as the most complicated thing we know about in the universe, and makes the thought-provoking suggestion that some of the best understood phenomena are actually far away in the cosmos, while the everyday phenomena, especially those involving entities as complex as human beings, can be more intractable than anything in the inanimate world. And I think he gives a wonderful example of this intractability. Well, he doesn't. I found this in the suggestion that some of the biggest challenges that the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration has had to deal with have been and may remain social rather than technical, with the chair of Harvard's Department of Astronomy stating that, and I quote him, "The biggest achievement of this project is being able to coordinate different observatories in different countries around the world, as astronomers are quite competitive. And convincing hundreds of them to work together and figure out who the leader is, why that person should be the leader, and how they should all get credit is quite a challenge." Now, while it may be hoped that developments in science and technology, in education and institutional reform will provide solutions to the issues we currently face, from another secular perspective, in 2012, two philosophers, one Australian and one Swedish, argued that the radical transformation of our social and natural environments by advanced scientific technology has exposed a fundamental flaw in the human condition. They suggested that human beings are not by nature equipped with a moral psychology that empowers them to cope with the moral problems that these new conditions of life create. This led them to conclude that addressing the current challenges of things like global climate change, weapons of mass destruction, and widening economic inequality will require major behavioural adjustments that our moral dispositions may render us incapable of making. They therefore suggested, with chilling Huxleyan undertones, that we might now have to consider applying technology to our own nature in the form of moral bioenhancement, or really a nice pill that will enable us to make the necessary adjustments. So the fundamental question of whether human altruism and or technological endeavour will be sufficient to restore the broken relationships that exist amidst humankind and between humankind, the environment and other species appears to remain unanswered from a secular perspective. Regardless of their origin, the forces of chaos remain rampant and continue to do harm, exposing vulnerability and generating fear about the future. To an increasingly secular world, the biblical response to these forces presents the potentially unpalatable challenge that human agency alone will never be enough to overcome them. The biblical representation of evil in the form of a supernatural creature offers, however, hope in the possibility of resistance. In establishing evil as a separate but dependent entity that is reliant on being able to feed on the potential for evil within the human condition, it becomes an outer as well as an inner force. It is therefore a force that can be resisted, which from a biblical perspective is due to its ultimate defeat that lies at the heart of biblical narratives. A defeat that is initiated through the incarnation account in the Lucan narrative, brought about in the crucifixion and resurrection narratives, and definitively concluded in the Revelation narratives. So I come now to this idea that the defeat of the forces of darkness by the light of Christian hope is a key feature of the Revelation narrative. But it is light that, if not extinguished in contemporary societies, appears to many to have grown increasingly dim. An interpretive approach of informed receptivity that adopts the concepts of radical departure from the familiar to an imaginative alternative that extends the boundaries of the thinkable, I want to suggest offers a potential way forward to the discovery of the full spectrum light of Christian hope that emerges from biblical narrative. And when I talk about this full spectrum light, I think in this respect, the vision of the woman, the dragon, and the child that's portrayed in Revelation 12 has conceptual similarities, I might be pushing this one, to the image of the radiant light that we see here in this image of Cassiopeia, a supernova. And this image was produced by the Fermi Large Area Telescope collaboration. You cannot say these things quickly. There's a lot of time to get through some of these phrases. This was 2011, and it's a composite image. It has the light of the full electromagnetic spectrum. It's got gamma rays from NASA's Fermi Gamma Ray Space Telescope shown in magenta, X-rays from NASA's Chandra X-ray Observatory in blue and green. The visible light data from Hubble is in yellow, infrared data from NASA's Spitzer Space Telescope in red, and radio data from the Very Large Array in orange. Now, contemporary cosmology does not, of course, explain John's cosmic visions. But in a way, I think this image potentially offers an insight into how biblical narrative uses imagery which traverses the full spectrum of theological light in order to present aspects of reality that are invisible to the naked eye. Seeing the light from the perspective of the revelation narrative is not, however, reliant on the visual and dependent on the development of advanced technology, because for all its apparent concreteness and vividness, the imagery of particularly apocalyptic writing is essentially non-visual and non-pictorial. While such writing appears to paint specific pictures, the images are often almost impossible to put into composite pictorial form, with the otherworldly or fantastic imagery suggesting a world that transcends ordinary reality. The reality of the biblical world is therefore portrayed in narrative that requires the hero or reader to listen rather than look in order to learn about a reality that seems to defy the human experience of time and space. This requirement to listen has also emerged in astrophysics, with the announcement in February 2016 that a new window on the universe had been opened with the detection of gravitational waves. And I think about it, it's really a window. We're looking, but we are having to listen here. Because due to their complete darkness in the absence of any light, it was only in 2015 that the existence of astronomy's cosmic beast could be confirmed, as the gravitational waves resulting from the collision and merger of two black holes about 1.3 billion years ago were detected when LIGO recorded the faint rising tone, or what they call fleeting chirp, of the now tiny ripples that were once waves resulting from the collision. According to the LIGO press release, these are waves which carry information about their dramatic origins and about the nature of gravity that cannot otherwise be obtained. The discovery of their existence has therefore been described as an inflection point that will change the course of science, as areas that are off limits to light can now be examined. In this respect, and again I quote, gravitational waves tell an unseen story, a story that we can hear but not see and must therefore listen to in order to better understand the reality of the vast cosmic landscape. The biblical story is also one that we can hear but not see, so must listen to in order to better understand the reality of the biblical landscape, a landscape that is first encountered as darkness covering the face of the deep until God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, according to Martin Rees, again speaking from the perspective of science, we are linked to the cosmos. He says all living things depend on the stars. They are energized by the heat and light from the sun. They are made of atoms that were forged from pristine hydrogen billions of years ago in faraway stars. The biblical perspective is in some ways similar in acknowledging the link to the cosmos through our creation from the dust of the ground. Its unique point of difference is, however, that humankind is also made in the image of God, from whom the breath of life is given. It therefore gives humankind an additional dependency and source of energy that is manifest in the love of God, a transcendent love that is revealed through the redemptive act of incarnation and the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ. So where is our biblical radiant light in the darkness? While the book of Revelation was once thought to be written during a period of violent persecution, many actually now contend that it addresses the isolation and oppression that early Christians experienced due to the economic and social persecution and the consequent temptation to accommodate themselves to the economic, social, and political pressures of the dominant culture. Regardless of the situation, it offered a message of hope in troubled times. Hope that was not solely dependent or reliant on human resources to defeat the forces of chaos in whatever form they took. The current state of both our planet and human society indicates that Nagle is correct in suggesting that we have only reached a very primitive stage of moral development. His assumption that a much longer journey lies ahead of us is chilling, but his belief that it would be foolish to try to lay down in advance the outlines for a correct method for ethical progress is challenged by the biblical narratives. In shedding biblical light in its varying forms on the vulnerability and fallibility of the human condition, the narratives offer the possibility of and method for ethical progress, and the restoration of broken relationships through the transformative creativity of a loving God. A transformative creativity which is inherent in humankind, made in his image, and activated by his spirit, thereby offering hope amidst the challenges of darkness in whatever form. It's this hope that resounds in the final chapter of the book of Revelation, in which the radiant light has finally defeated this darkness, and is explained in the words, "It is I, Jesus, who am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star." Thank you. A few liberties there with science. Now, this is the time to say my background is in the arts. Think poetry, painting, imagination. There's a lot to think. I'm sorry if I was a bit quiet. I hope the stunned silence is a good thing.
No.
As she can.
I don't have a question, but I want to say that I think you're entirely right that the issue to be dealt with is hermeneutics. So I find your talk fascinating.
Thank you.
I hope someone else has thought of a question.
Well, there was an awful lot that I tried to cover, and I do apologise for that, because these are things that I draw out and give a lot more time to, obviously, in my thesis.
Yes.
But I'm a layperson who reads popular science, and actually Nagle got pilloried for his book. He does call himself a layperson who reads widely in popular science, but he did offend people for the critique that he made.
I read Nagle 40 years ago when he was exceedingly secular, positivist, hardline.
But I just think he offers, and his issue about reductionism, I think, is very interesting. And I think what for me came out of it was how the biblical text doesn't need our defense really as such. It needs us to learn how to get into the spirit. This is why I was fascinated by the battle or the struggle in 20th century science to come to terms with quantum reality and the counterintuitive nature of it. And I know you have to be very careful, and I have leapt from one thing to another, but as I read the language that's being used to talk about some of these things in astrophysics, I thought, well, we're talking about wonders, we're talking about creation, we're talking about destruction, and that's really what's happening in our biblical meta-narrative. And why have we lost this? Because it is, when I hear secular philosophers saying we need medical bioenhancement, I think, is that really all we can come up with? And now the secular philosophers are saying we're not nice enough, we haven't evolved enough to catch up with the sort of moral decisions we're having to make.
Thank you. Come closer to the distance I might.
Right, okay.
Was that actually a quote from Nagle when you said that Nagle doesn't just not believe in the story of God, but doesn't want the story of God?
Yes.
Because, of course, the pursuit of knowledge and understanding is not achieved through the filter of what we want, or accepting what we want and rejecting what we dislike.
Well,
because quantum mechanics would never have arisen, with that filter. So it's a very dangerous thing for him to say.
He talks about the impact of what he calls the fear of religion, and the fact that so much of what we hear, particularly from the Richard Dawkins and some of the people out there who really don't want there to be any room for God at all, he thinks that this fear of religion has driven a very reductionist sort of drive to explain everything in a certain way. So he comes out in a rather vulnerable way and sort of says, I'm admitting that it's not just that I don't believe in God, I just don't want there to be a God. I don't want that to be the answer. He is quite sympathetic to intelligent design, and he's one of the more sympathetic philosophers he's reviewed books. I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but he's prepared to listen to good arguments. So
I think he believes him. You think he does believe, he just doesn't.
Well, you just want to say that you're making it so difficult. He's going down a sort of the teleology. He's dabbled in panpsychism, and I'm really interested to see how many books now are coming out. There's this one recent one by a philosopher talking about panpsychism. Now people are talking about quantum consciousness and what does it mean to have an observer, and part of me thinks it's interesting how far people will go to get rid of religion. They're prepared to go to multiverse theory, holographic theory, string theory, that are of course speculative. Anything to get rid of God.
Nice to mention Andrea Ghez, who has just received the Nobel Prize for the discovery of that black hole at the center of our galaxy. She's the fourth only woman to achieve a Nobel Prize in physics. So it's very topical.
Yeah.
Reductionism doesn't get a very good rap all over the place, and obviously not from Nagle. And yet it seems that the universe that we live in is very amenable to the reductionist approach. We could never, without reductionism, we could never have written the story of the universe going back 13.8 to plus or minus 0.02 billion years. And we know so much about it on the grand scale as a result of reductionism. So I'm always one who sort of puts up my hand for reductionism because it works so well. You have to recognize that there are things that you will miss because complex systems have completely new states that can arise that are not amenable to reductionism. But reductionism is only a step along the journey, So you use the principles of reductionism to extract information, but you're always stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, and then you're going in closer again here, and then you're stepping back. And it's by that digging in and stepping back that the story of the universe has been,
I think Nagle acknowledges where it has a place. I mean, his big thing is consciousness, and it interests me that there is a split, and people who were very much about it all being reduced to neurons would all explain it through reductionism. Some of the people like Christoph Koch, and people are now saying they don't think that's the case, that consciousness is a fundamental. And this is getting into panpsychism in some areas, that what do we mean if people don't want to go there as with God and intelligent design and God is mind in some sort. It's interesting. I think the latest things I've read have said that consciousness is present, but it's not present in the table as such, but it's present in the atoms in a very simple form. And I haven't read everything, obviously, but there are books coming out now talking about this. But I'm not sure what that offers us in terms of the problems that we face. Not that what I think the Christian faith offers us, and understanding who we are and where it fits. But I think reductionism has a place, but when it comes to biblical interpretation, I worry when we reduce the text to something less than it is by breaking it into little pieces. And we say, oh, this here is history and this here is not. I think the text carries elements of both. We have to have certain things that I believe are fundamental to our Christology. If we lose them, we have to say what's left in terms that is Christian. But I'm not going to argue that the dragon in Revelation is historical. And in a way, playing with these ideas today is to say how we can enjoy or see the limits of language. And I don't know what you thought about that quote from a physicist about how we will need a story of quantum mechanics. I don't know whether the maths will fade away, as he says. This was in a private correspondence, he said it, so I'm not sure if he published that. But this idea of story and how we see truth in story is changing as we're now respecting individual stories. We don't say to somebody, oh, your story isn't true, although we might know that there's a subjective element to it. So it's been, the slippery word is philosophical. I'm talking too much.
Well, thank you for introducing the word consciousness. I take issue a little bit with Jeff's, consciousness, I'm looking at the words on your screen there, radiant light in the darkness. And all I can think of is Rod Johnson and Donald Trump in those words. Because black and white is like good and bad, black and white.
I have to get rid of it. Or...
I think, personally, I believe we're on a journey from lesser consciousness to greater consciousness. I found it interesting you use the word black hole in the same sentence as chaos. And I got thinking, just because it's unknown to us, why do we use the word, I think chaos has a negative meaning. The word black hole. Maybe it's a portal in one of these 11 dimensions that's meant to exist in the quantum world. And as we grow in maturity and consciousness and a little bit of understanding of reductionism and greater awareness of the greater, maybe that's the next step for us. And the word chaos, it's the opposite of that. It's the opportunity.
Look, I knew I was throwing out a lot of ideas, and actually what was interesting to me was the feedback, because you know that people will hear things in different ways. And so there was a risk. I'm not really trying to pin anything down. I was just trying to make some connections, I think. I'm not a physicist. I really am out of my depth. I'm going to hand over to Jeff when he asks me a gnarly question in that area. I think what this journey of my study has taken me on is just an awareness of how things are more wonderful. It is an amazing world, as Nagle says, and this is what science is showing us, that there's so much more than we can know. And I liked Nagle's idea that we may never understand some of it. I mean, we conceptually, and I think what's happened, what I've heard happening to our biblical narratives in that text, is that we've just reduced it to something that's losing its power. It doesn't need our defense in a way. It's there, it's operating at the edge of something. It's Annie Dillard says in one of her books that God hasn't shrunk, God has spread. As our knowledge of the universe spreads, God gets bigger as well. And I love that idea. I like the mystery. I like the fact that we don't have to have all the answers. And there isn't the security, I think, that we once hoped in saying these are the absolutes. Now, I do think for me, there are certain fundamentals about the Christian faith that have to be there, that we have to see Christ in a specific role. I'm happy to say that. But I do understand the struggle. I spent a lot of time, one chapter on the virgin birth. How do we understand that today? And particularly if we're going to continue saying a creed. And actually, although I've wrestled with these things, I've come to a certain peace about the fact that these are just words that are dealing with huge concepts. And there's some reassurance in that, in a funny sort of way. And I see it happening in science in a way, because science is, I used to think these disciplines existed almost in isolation, but I'm now finding physicists who are poets, physicists who paint. And I don't think you can look at this and not be moved by. But I heard somebody talk at a conference and I realized that the physicists in some ways have become the new psalmists. Brian Cox can fill an auditorium talking about the cosmos. People will listen. And we've lost that ability, I think, in the church. We don't. I heard somebody at a conference say, this was a priest saying, are you saying we have to explain to people what the psalmists mean when they talk about the wonders of the heavens? And the speaker said, well, yes, you do today. We've sort of lost that ground, which is such a shame. And sometimes we're trying to defend high poetry. That's not perhaps the concrete story that we once thought, but it's a window to something much bigger.
Can I ask a question? You mentioned couple of philosophers who basically come to
Sorry, that human.
philosophers, you mentioned two philosophers, came to the conclusion that humans are not well adapted to deal with global crises. I didn't catch them.
I didn't actually give you their names. I will have to find those in my footnotes, but I can tell you them.
But I was wondering if they read any annotations of those, and were published anthropologists would confirm the old idea that in human society, for example, it's me against my brother, and then me and my brother against our cousin, and then me and my brother and our cousin against somebody else, and all of us against a stranger. So the hierarchy is of attachment, and there is a limit to the number of people who can relate to at all. And so therefore, humans who live in small societies in global population simply can't get together. In cooperation will be required to come to a common way of dealing with common problems. It's innate in us, or at least the absence of the means to do that is it's not a philosophical conversation, it's just biology. But I agree with that. If you could find the names of the person.
Look, I will. One's Swedish, and it's quite complicated, so I'll certainly send them to you. It's interesting how now there's quite a lot coming out about what we can learn from hunter-gatherers and going back to those small communities and their relationship with the environment. Critique of
story is very important to a scientist. I mean, first of all, this is the story of the universe. So that's a big story. But I think, on the whole, my impression is that the progress of science is that a story is contemplated. There's a sense in which you capture an idea. Maybe you come up with a sentence in your mind, and then you have to experiment to find the words that make that sentence, if that makes sense. Or when it's a grand discovery, often it's the overall story that is contemplated. You feel in your bones that this is what's happening. And then you might dig around for 20 years. In the case of Einstein and black holes, in the case of Einstein and gravitational radiation, 100 years. So he came up with a story.
yes.
And it took 100 years for the sentences and the individual words and the individual letters to be put in place. And I think really story is so important to the progress of science, and that's the way it progresses. It doesn't progress by having a letter here and then attaching another letter and then another, oh, that's a word, and so on. It goes the other way.
And Einstein talked a lot about the imagination and the role of the imagination. And I think, for a while it seemed to me that to talk about imagination in the Bible seemed to be somehow detrimental to it. It seemed to be making it fantasy rather than. But that's why I like the idea of the imagination being productive, and there's somebody who talks about it as being our point of contact with God. That's the way we can have contact with God. So the imagination doesn't have to be something that's not real or not true, and that's what science offers.
Would you like to comment, just as you've been talking, the possibility that the biblical refusal to make an image of God, so that people had to stretch in their imagination and come with models, shepherd, father, king, rock, that in fact created biblically primed minds to start thinking scientifically. Just as we don't have an image of God, we don't have an image of an electron. But it's a part of a wave, a cloud of probability, it's a partial differential equation. That having an unpicturable God is at the base of scientific thinking.
I think it's a terribly important concept, and I think we often forget that, and perhaps we just get stuck on the Sistine Chapel roof or something, and we have this image of, they're powerful ones, but I use that a lot, the fact that God is a rock, God is a lamb, and obviously not a literal one of those, but they all have qualities are so important. And I mean, I guess what I wanted to do today was show that science and scripture are not that far apart. They're doing different things, but if we bring them together, it's so much more exciting than putting them at odds. And I worry because I'm not a scientist. I'm the John Polkinghorns of this world, you know, steeped in both the science and the theology. And theology is enough for me. I still find that such an enormous subject. But no, I think that there's a lot that you can say science has. The trouble is we've been conditioned by perspectives throughout history and perspectives of how things have happened. And this is what I hear saddens. We have access to so much information now, so it's very easy for somebody to build an argument and bring in a defense for it. But there's always other perspectives. And so yes, I agree with you.